What if the move that looked like pure incompetence was actually the moment the war was decided? What if commanders watching from a distance, soldiers trapped inside a chaos, and even the enemy themselves all misread the same action at the same time? History is filled with bold maneuvers, but this one stood apart because, in the first critical minutes, it looked undeniably wrong. Not risky, not daring. Wrong. The kind of movement that violates doctrine, breaks formation, logic, and triggers panic rather than confidence. The kind of maneuver that makes officers grip maps tighter and makes seasoned soldiers whisper that someone has just doomed them all. At the heart of this story is a battlefield moment where certainty collapsed. The terrain was hostile, visibility imperfect, intelligence fragmented. Orders had been issued based on assumptions that no longer held, but no one knew it. In that environment, every movement mattered. Every deviation from expectation carried consequences measured in lives. And then it happened. A unit shifted direction when it should have held. A force advanced when retreat was expected. A formation bent instead of locking into place. To outside observers, it looked like a breakdown in command and control, a fatal hesitation, or a catastrophic miscalculation. Military doctrine exists for a reason. It is built from blood, repetition, and failure. It teaches commanders what not to do as much as what to do. In this war, one rule had been drilled relentlessly into every officer involved. Break this rule, and you expose your flank. Break this rule, and you invite encirclement. Break this rule, and the enemy will exploit you before you can recover. That rule had shaped planning, training, and expectation on both sides of the conflict. It was so deeply ingrained that even the enemy structured their own countermeasures around it. And that is exactly why the maneuver that followed seemed like a mistake. As the movements unfolded, confusion spread almost instantly. Reports conflicted. Forward observers struggled to understand what they were seeing. Communication lagged behind reality. Units on the ground acted on partial information, while higher command interpreted the maneuver through the lens of doctrine, not context. To them, the situation looked like collapse in slow motion. Some believed an order had been misunderstood. Others suspected a junior commander had panicked. A few feared something worse, that the entire operational plan was unraveling in real time. The enemy saw it too. From their perspective, the movement confirmed everything they believed about the situation. They had been waiting for a mistake, a sign of weakness, a break in cohesion. This looked like it. Their intelligence officers interpreted it as validation. Their field commanders adjusted accordingly, confident they were about to exploit a fatal error. Forces began to reposition, not defensively, but aggressively. They committed resources based on an assumption that seemed obvious. The maneuver made no sense unless the side executing it had lost control. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Not everyone involved was acting blindly. Embedded within that apparent error was a subtle understanding of timing, terrain, and enemy psychology, a realization that the battlefield was no longer operating according to the assumptions written in manuals. The maneuver did not aim to achieve immediate dominance. It aimed to provoke a reaction, to pull the enemy out of alignment, to force decisions based on what they expected to see, not what was actually unfolding. This is where the true tension of the moment lived. For several crucial intervals, the maneuver offered no visible proof of success. There was no dramatic breakthrough. Nusadang Hevesau only uncertainty. Soldiers executing the movement did not know if it would work. Commanders watching it unfold could not be sure whether they were witnessing brilliance or disaster. The enemy, convinced they were seeing weakness, leaned further into their interpretation. Every side acted under pressure, guided by belief rather than certainty. War often turns not on firepower alone, but on perception, on what each side thinks the other is doing. In this case, perception became the battlefield. The maneuver exploited that fact with ruthless precision, even if you recognized it at the time. What looked like an error was carefully positioned to invite overconfidence. What seemed like loss of control was actually an attempt to seize control of the enemy's decision-making cycle. By the time anyone realized that the movement was not a mistake, events were already in motion. Forces had shifted. Commitments had been made. Options had narrowed. The battlefield was transforming quietly, invisibly, shaped by reactions rather than intentions. The most dangerous phase of the maneuver was not the execution itself, but the waiting, the moment where nothing obvious happens, where doubt grows, and where reversing course would be impossible. And that is where this story truly begins. Because the real question is not why the maneuver looked wrong, but why everyone believed it was wrong at the same time. The answer to that question explains how a single misunderstood movement became one of the most unexpected turns of the war, and why its consequences reached far beyond that battlefield. If this moment already made you question how many so-called mistakes in war were actually misunderstood decisions, take a second right now to engage with this story. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought was happening at first. Did it feel like incompetence, desperation, or sheer madness? Understanding moments like this matters, because wars are not decided only by strength or numbers, but by perception, timing, and the ability to manipulate how the enemy thinks. If this kind of hidden military history fascinates you, hit the like button so more people can discover these overlooked turning points. And make sure you are subscribed to the channel. That way, you do not miss the next layer of this story as it unfolds. To understand why this maneuver seemed unforgivable in the moment, you have to understand the rule it violated. Not a casual guideline, not a flexible suggestion, but a core principle drilled into commanders until it became instinct. This rule existed because breaking it had destroyed armies before. It was written into field manuals, reinforced in war colleges, and validated by decades of previous conflicts. Follow it, and you minimized risk. Ignore it, and you exposed yourself to rapid collapse. Every officer on that battlefield knew this rule. More importantly, the enemy knew it too. The rule was simple in theory and brutal in practice. Never yield positional coherence under pressure. Never create ambiguity in your own formation while the enemy is still capable of decisive action. In conventional terms, this meant maintaining alignment, preserving predictable support lines, and avoiding movements that could be interpreted as retreat or disorganization unless collapse was already inevitable. History had proven that the moment an army appeared uncertain, the opposing force would accelerate its aggression. Hesitation invited annihilation. This doctrine shaped everything leading up to the maneuver. Plans were built around stability. Units were positioned to reinforce each other, not to provoke reactions. Intelligence assessments assumed that both sides would act rationally according to these shared rules. Even contingency plans were conservative, focused on damage control rather than psychological disruption. No one expected innovation at this stage of the campaign. Innovation was for desperate moments or decisive breakthroughs, not for holding operations under pressure. The battlefield itself reinforced this thinking. Terrain constrained movement, communication, delays punished improvisation. Visibility limitations magnified the danger of misinterpretation. A single unit moving unexpectedly could trigger chain reactions far beyond its immediate area. That is why adherence to doctrine was not just encouraged, it was enforced. Deviating from it required overwhelming justification, and even then, it was rarely attempted. Yet this rule contained a hidden weakness. It assumed symmetry. It assumed that both sides would interpret movement the same way, respond the same way, and value the same risks. Over time, this assumption became invisible. Commanders stopped questioning it because it had worked for so long. The enemy built their tactics around exploiting predictable compliance. Their countermeasures were tuned to detect violations and punish them instantly. That confidence would become their vulnerability. When the maneuver began, observers immediately framed it through this doctrinal lens. There was no alternative interpretation. A force that moved this way was either panicking or incompetent. There was no third category. That binary thinking narrowed everyone's perception. It collapsed complexity into a single conclusion: mistake. The speed with which this conclusion spread is what made the maneuver so dangerous and so powerful at the same time. Orders and reactions cascaded from that assumption. Enemy units accelerated. Instead of supporting elements shifted aggressively, believing they were closing in on a fracture. Friendly units hesitated, unsure whether to compensate for what they believed was an error or wait for clarification. High command delayed intervention, assuming the situation would either correct itself or collapse quickly. In those moments, the maneuver existed in a vacuum of misunderstanding. What makes this episode extraordinary is that the rule being broken was not obsolete. It was still valid in most situations. Breaking it blindly would have led to disaster, exactly as doctrine predicted. The difference here was intent. The maneuver was not an accident, nor was it a gamble made out of desperation. It was a calculative violation designed to exploit the enemy's dependence on that very rule. By stepping outside the shared framework of expectations, the force executing the maneuver temporarily controlled the narrative of the battlefield. They forced everyone else to interpret events using outdated assumptions. This bought them something far more valuable than territory or firepower. Time. Time for the enemy to commit incorrectly. Time for perception to harden into certainty. Time for reactions to become irreversible. For several critical phases, nothing about the maneuver looked successful. It did not generate immediate tactical advantage. It did not relieve pressure. It did not reassure allies. In fact, it increased tension across the entire operational area. That tension was the point. The maneuver weaponized discomfort, uncertainty, and overconfidence all at once. Only later would analysts realize that the rule itself had not failed. It had been used against those who trusted it too much. The battlefield had not changed, but the psychology governing it had been turned inside out. What followed next was not a sudden victory, but a series of small enemy decisions made under false certainty, each one pushing them closer to a trap they did not know existed. The first reactions were not strategic. They were human. Confusion hit before analysis could even begin. Officers stared at field reports that did not match their mental maps. Messengers arrived breathless with fragments of information that contradicted what observers thought they had just seen. On the ground, soldiers felt something was wrong long before they understood what it was. Movements that should have aligned did not. Support that was expected did not appear where it should. The battlefield felt unstable, as if gravity itself had shifted. Within minutes, the maneuver was being discussed not as a development, but as a failure. Voices rose over radios. Some demanded clarification. Others demanded immediate correction. A few demanded accountability. In war, the fear of error often outweighs the fear of the enemy, because error suggests loss of control. And control is the illusion that keeps men moving forward under fire. The maneuver threatened that illusion. Among Allied units, the reaction was a dangerous mix of restraint and panic. Junior officers hesitated to act independently, afraid of compounding what they believed was a mistake. Senior commanders hesitated to intervene too aggressively, uncertain whether they were misreading a deliberate action. This hesitation created a vacuum. In that vacuum, assumptions hardened. The longer no correction came, the more convinced everyone became that something had gone terribly wrong. The enemy reaction was faster and far more confident. From their perspective, the situation finally made sense. They had anticipated resistance, rigidity, adherence to doctrine. What they saw, instead, looked like fracture. The maneuver confirmed their belief that pressure was working. That belief triggered aggression. Units were ordered forward with urgency, not caution. Timetables were compressed. Reserves were committed earlier than planned. Risk tolerance shifted almost instantly. This psychological shift mattered more than any single movement on the map. Once an enemy belief's collapse has begun, they stop asking whether it is real. They ask only how to exploit it fastest. That urgency changes behavior. It reduces verification. It narrows perception. Commanders who moments earlier were methodical became bold. Boldness felt justified. After all, they believed they were witnessing an opponent lose cohesion. At the same time, internal doubts multiplied. Among those executing the maneuver, soldiers followed orders, but uncertainty gnawed them. They could not see the broader picture. They only felt exposure. They moved into positions that felt wrong, vulnerable, unfinished. Every instinct trained into them screamed that they were doing something dangerous. That psychological strain is rarely captured in after-action reports, but it defines moments like this. The hardest orders to obey are not the ones that promise sacrifice, but the ones that look like failure. This is where many historical maneuvers collapse, not because the idea is flawed, but because confidence erodes faster than patience. Leaders second-guess. Units drift back toward familiar patterns. The maneuver dissolves under its own ambiguity. What makes this episode extraordinary is that the ambiguity was allowed to persist. No immediate reassurance was given. No visible correction was made. Silence, in this case, became a weapon. As minutes stretched into longer intervals, the confusion deepened. Friendly units adjusted defensively, not aggressively, further reinforcing the illusion of disorder. Enemy elements pushed harder, accelerating into positions they had not fully Each side was reacting rationally to what they believed was happening, yet those beliefs were fundamentally misaligned with reality. Crucially, this confusion did not produce chaos everywhere. It produced focus in the wrong places. Attention shifted toward the apparent mistake and away from subtler changes unfolding elsewhere on the battlefield. Resources were redirected. Eyes followed the wrong movement. The maneuver acted like a flare, drawing perception toward itself, while other conditions quietly changed. In warfare, moments of misinterpretation are common. What is rare is when misinterpretation is sustained long enough to reshape decisions at scale. That is what happened here. The confusion was not a byproduct. It was an environment, one that encouraged the enemy to move faster, commit deeper, and abandon caution, while allies waited, uncertain whether they were watching failure or something far more dangerous. The shock did not fade. It compounded, and with every passing decision made under false clarity, the battlefield moved closer to a point where reversal would be impossible. The maneuver had not yet revealed its purpose, but its effects were already propagating outward, shaping actions on both sides in ways no single commander fully controlled. What almost no one noticed in those early moments was the detail that made the maneuver viable in the first place. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It did not appear on situation maps or radio summaries. It lived in the margins of the battlefield, in factors most commanders registered subconsciously but rarely centered in their decisions. Timing, terrain, fatigue, and expectation had aligned in a way that made the apparent mistake something else entirely. The terrain was the first clue, though few recognized it. The area where the maneuver unfolded was not uniform. From a distance, it appeared open and permissive, but up close it fractured into channels, dead zones, and constricted approaches that favored movement over static control. Conventional doctrine treated the ground as something to be held, or the maneuver treated it as something to be passed through, something that could distort pursuit rather than invite it. The enemy believed they were advancing into advantage, unaware that their momentum was narrowing their options. Then there was timing. The maneuver did not occur at the height of combat, nor during elal, but in a transitional window when units were repositioned, resupplying, and mentally resetting. This is when vigilance drops slightly, when assumptions replace verification. The enemy's forward elements were confident but tired. Their decision-making cycles were already strained by sustained pressure. The maneuver inserted itself into that fatigue, exploiting the delay between perception and correction. Fatigue is a force multiplier when used correctly. Tired units move faster when they believe success is imminent, not slower. They push beyond caution. They shortcut reconnaissance. They trust instincts over analysis. The maneuver counted on this. It did not aim to defeat fresh forces at full awareness. It aimed to accelerate tired forces into committing themselves where retreats would be costly and coordination fragile. Another overlooked factor was communication lag. Orders on both sides were moving slower than events on the ground. This is normal in war, but here it mattered more than usual. By the time higher commands began questioning the maneuver, subordinate units had already acted on earlier assumptions. Those actions could not be undone quickly. Even if someone recognized the deeper intent, reversing course would have created even greater confusion. The window for intervention closed quietly, without ceremony, but the most critical, ignored detail was psychological. The maneuver relied on the enemy wanting it to be a mistake. Years of experience had conditioned them to recognize patterns of collapse. They knew what a failing opponent looked like. When the movement matched that pattern closely enough, they stopped asking deeper questions. Confirmation bias took over. Every subsequent observation was interpreted to support the initial conclusion. Signals that might have suggested something else were dismissed as anomalies. This psychological trap was reinforced by the behavior of friendly units nearby. They did not rush forward. They did not counterattack. They held, adjusted, absorbed pressure. To the enemy, this looked like indecision spreading outward. In reality, it was containment. The maneuver did not demand immediate exploitation by friendly forces. It demanded patience, discipline, and restraint. Those qualities rarely look impressive in the middle of uncertainty, but they are devastating when paired with enemy over. Another subtle factor was scale. The maneuver was deliberately limited. It did not involve massed forces or sweeping changes. That made it harder to interpret correctly. Large maneuvers invite scrutiny. Small ones are easier to misread. The enemy saw a local problem, not a systemic one. They responded locally, escalating without realizing they were reinforcing a broader shift in the battle's geometry. Even the lack of visible success was part of the design. No immediate gains meant no obvious reason to reassess. If the maneuver had produced early advantages, it might have triggered caution. Instead, it produced discomfort and apparent vulnerability. That vulnerability became bait. The enemy leaned into it, convinced that pressure would finish the job. What history would later recognize is that the maneuver did not seek to win ground. It sought to win decisions. Every ignored detail fed into that objective. Terrain funneled movement, fatigue accelerated commitment. Communication lag prevented correction. Psychology locked interpretation into a single narrative. None of these elements alone would have been decisive. Together, they created a situation where the enemy's best option felt obvious and wrong at the same time. By the time these details became visible to analysts, it was already too late to matter tactically. The battlefield had shifted beneath the participants' feet. Forces were no longer positioned according to doctrine, but according to belief, and belief, once acted upon at scale, becomes reality. The maneuver still looked like a mistake that illusion held, but beneath it, the conditions for reversal were quietly disappearing, replaced by a narrowing path that led the enemy exactly where they least expected to go. The enemy did not hesitate, because hesitation would have contradicted everything they believed was happening. From their vantage point, the maneuver confirmed a long-held expectation. Pressure had finally broken cohesion. What they thought they were seeing was not innovation, but failure. And once that interpretation took hold, their next steps followed a predictable pattern that felt logical, justified, and urgent. The first error was speed. Convinced they were facing collapse, enemy commanders accelerated their tempo. Units that were supposed to advance cautiously began pushing forward with minimal pause. Reconnaissance was shortened. Flanks were assumed to be secure. The priority shifted from understanding the situation to exploiting it before the opportunity disappeared. In war, speed can be decisive, but only when paired with clarity. Here, speed replaced clarity entirely. The second error was concentration. Forces that should have remained flexible were funneled toward the perceived weakness. This created density where dispersion was safer. Artillery, reserves, and mobile elements were committed earlier than doctrine advised. The belief was simple. A collapsing opponent cannot counterattack effectively. What this ignored was that the opponent was not collapsing at all, but shaping the battlefield to receive that concentration. The third error was narrative lock-in. Once higher command framed the maneuver as a mistake, dissenting interpretations became harder to voice. Reports that suggested something unusual was happening were discounted as confusion or subordinate commanders, sensing the expectation, filtered their observations accordingly. This is how organizations fail quietly, not through lack of information, but through selective attention. As the enemy pushed forward, their formations stretched. Coordination between advancing elements degraded. Communication lines lengthened under movement. Supporting units struggled to keep pace. None of this triggered alarm because it matched the internal story of imminent victory. The faster they moved, the more committed they became to that story. Each kilometer advance was another investment in the belief that the maneuver was an error. The most dangerous mistake, however, was psychological overconfidence. The enemy began to anticipate surrender, retreat, or disorder that never came. They planned for outcomes rather than contingencies. This altered their posture. Aggression replaced caution. Predictability replaced adaptability. The maneuver had done something subtle but devastating. It made the enemy stop thinking defensively. There were moments when the miscalculation could still have been corrected. Isolated commanders noticed anomalies. Resistance was firmer than expected. Terrain behaved differently than maps suggested. Friendly units encountered friction where they anticipated ease, but these signals were interpreted as delays, not warnings. After all, no collapse is perfectly clean. Every victory has resistance. That assumption blinded them. What the enemy failed to recognize was that they were no longer reacting to the battlefield itself, but to their interpretation of it. The maneuver had shifted the center of gravity from physical control to cognitive control. Once that shift occurred, the enemy's actions became increasingly detached from reality. They advanced into positions that favored counteraction. They exposed logistical chains. They committed themselves in ways that made withdrawal costly and coordination fragile. Meanwhile, the force executing the maneuver did not respond with dramatic counterstrokes. That restraint was intentional. A visible reaction might have disrupted the illusion. Instead, they absorbed pressure, yielded space selectively, and allowed the enemy to define the pace. Every enemy decision made under false confidence deepened their entanglement. By the time the enemy realized that the expected collapse was not materializing, the situation had changed irreversibly. Their forces were no longer positioned to exploit weakness, but to be exploited. Their speed had become their concentration had become vulnerability. Their confidence had become inertia. The maneuver had succeeded not by outmaneuvering the enemy physically, but by letting the enemy maneuver themselves into disadvantage. What looked like a mistake had triggered a cascade of enemy decisions that could no longer be undone, without admitting a fundamental misreading of the battlefield. And that admission came too late, because the next phase of the maneuver did not involve sudden movement or surprise attacks. It involved watching the consequences of the enemy's own choices unfold, one irreversible step at a time. What followed did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. There was no explosion of clarity, no instant realization that everything had gone wrong. Instead, the shift began quietly, almost invisibly, through a chain of small consequences that seemed insignificant on their own. This is how the maneuver truly took hold. Not through shock, but through accumulation. As enemy units advanced, minor delays began to appear. Supply elements struggled to keep up with the accelerated tempo. Communications grew less precise as movement outpaced coordination. These issues were noted but not prioritized. After all, victory appeared imminent. Minor friction was expected. What no one recognized was that each small delay interacted with the others, compounding pressure in ways that could not be resolved locally. At the same time, the terrain started to assert itself. Routes that looked passable on maps funneled movement into narrow corridors. Vehicles slowed. Formations compressed. Units stacked closer together than intended. This increased vulnerability without triggering alarm because concentration was still framed as strength. In reality, it reduced flexibility and amplified the cost of every subsequent decision. On the opposite side, The force executing the maneuver maintained a posture that looked passive, but was anything but. They did not rush to exploit openings. They did not reveal intent. They adjusted incrementally, preserving coherence while allowing the enemy to advance deeper into less forgiving space. Each adjustment was small enough to avoid attention, yet deliberate enough to shape outcomes. Psychologically, the domino effect was already underway. Enemy commanders became invested in their forward momentum. Turning back now would mean acknowledging that the earlier interpretation had been wrong. That hesitation is fatal in warfare, not because retreat is impossible, but because leaders delay it until it is no longer feasible. Pride and momentum fused into inertia. Another subtle consequence emerged in timing. As enemy forces pushed forward, they synchronized themselves around an assumption that was no longer accurate. Timelines built on that assumption began to slip. Coordinated actions lost alignment. Units that were meant to support one another arrived out of sequence. None of this triggered immediate crisis, but it eroded resilience. The system grew brittle. Crucially, this domino effect did not require active pressure to continue. It became self-sustaining. Every enemy action taken to correct minor issues introduced new ones. Every attempt to accelerate recovery deepened exposure. The maneuver had created a condition where effort itself produced diminishing returns. There were moments when enemy units encountered resistance that felt unexpectedly firm. Instead of reassessing, they interpreted this as desperation. Resistance confirmed their belief that collapse was near. That belief justified pushing harder, and pushing harder magnified every underlying weakness that had already been set in motion. From a distance, nothing about the battlefield looked extraordinary. Lines shifted slowly. Engagements occurred without spectacle. Losses mounted gradually, but beneath the surface, decision space was shrinking. Options were disappearing, not because they were denied, but because they were no longer perceived as viable. The enemy was narrowing their own future. This is the dangerous elegance of the maneuver. It did not seek to overwhelm. It sought to wait. Wait in war is often seen as weakness, but here it was a form of control. The longer the enemy acted under false certainty, the more tightly the situation locked into place. By the time higher-level commanders began questioning why progress was slower than expected, the answer was no longer actionable. The dominoes had already fallen. The issue was no longer misinterpretation. It was commitment. Forces were committed forward. Resources were committed. Psychologically, changing course would have required a pause that no one felt authorized to take, and so the chain reaction continued. One decision led to the next. Each choice constrained the following one. The maneuver did not force the enemy into error. It created an environment where error felt like success until it was irreversible. This was the quiet phase of victory. No banners raised, no dramatic announcements, just the steady narrowing of the battlefield around an opponent who believed they were winning. The maneuver still appeared flawed to anyone glancing at it superficially, but its real power was now undeniable to those who understood what to look for. The question was no longer whether the maneuver would work. The question was when its effects would become visible enough that denial was no longer possible. The moment the maneuver began to function was not announced by victory, but by hesitation, not on one side, but on both. That is when the illusion cracked. DNA, still advancing, started encountering resistance that no longer behaved like a retreating force. It was not aggressive in the traditional sense, but it was deliberate, selective, and increasingly expensive to push against. Progress slowed in ways that could not be explained by exhaustion alone. This was the inflection point. The battlefield had crossed from misunderstanding into consequence. The enemy's forward elements realized they were no longer exploiting weakness, but moving into resistance that absorbed pressure without breaking. Every attempt to force momentum now required disproportionate effort. Casualties increased, not dramatically, but persistently. Equipment losses mounted. Coordination frayed further. What had felt like acceleration now felt like drag. At this stage, the maneuver revealed its true design. It was never meant to produce a clean reversal. It was meant to transform speed into liability. The faster the enemy moved earlier, the deeper they had committed into a structure that limited their ability to adapt. Now, any adjustment required pulling forces back through constrained terrain, resynchronizing units that had already lost cohesion, and admitting that earlier assumptions were wrong. None of those steps happened quickly under fire. Enemy commanders began issuing corrective orders, but those orders conflicted with reality on the ground. Units were no longer positioned to respond cleanly. Communication delays meant corrections arrived late or incomplete. Some elements attempted to halt, others pressed forward. The result was fragmentation. The enemy was no longer acting as a unified force reacting to opportunity, but as disconnected elements reacting to friction. This is where the maneuver stopped looking like a mistake to those inside it. Friendly units recognized the shift not through triumph, but through clarity. The enemy was no longer dictating tempo. They were reacting. The battlefield felt different. Pressure no longer came in clean waves, but in uneven pulses. The sense of being hunted gave way to the sense of being observed, measured, and contained. Psychologically, this was devastating for the enemy. Confidence eroded unevenly. Some commanders clung to the original narrative, insisting success was still imminent. Others began questioning whether they had misread the situation entirely. That split in perception created hesitation at critical moments. Orders became cautious where they had been bold, aggressive where restraint was needed. The coherence that had driven early momentum dissolved. Importantly, the maneuver did not require a dramatic counterattack to capitalize on this shift. In fact, a sudden reversal might have disrupted the process. Instead, pressure was applied precisely where enemy commitment was highest and flexibility lowest. Engagements were chosen carefully. Time became an ally. Every minute spent under these conditions favored the force that had planned for endurance rather than immediacy. This was also the moment when retreat became psychologically impossible for the enemy. Pulling back would have required admitting that the initial interpretation was wrong. It would have required explaining losses without victory. In war, leaders often delay retreat not because it is impossible, but because it feels illegitimate. The maneuver exploited that hesitation mercilessly. What began as an apparent error had now reshaped the entire engagement. The enemy was caught between advancing into resistance they could not overcome efficiently and retreating through space that magnified their vulnerabilities. The battlefield had narrowed around them, not through encirclement, but through accumulated consequence. This is the paradox at the heart of the maneuver. It succeeded not by forcing the enemy into immediate crisis, but by waiting until their own decisions created it. The mistake had started working precisely when it stopped looking like one to the people who mattered most. By the time the enemy recognized that something was fundamentally wrong, their window to recover had already closed. What followed was not a clean countermeasure, but a series of late, disjointed attempts to regain control over a situation that no longer responded to intention. This is the phase where wars are quietly lost, not through defeat in battle, but through the inability to undo momentum. Orders began arriving that contradicted one another. Some units were told to pause and consolidate, others to press harder to break resistance, others to reposition entirely. These instructions reflected a deeper problem. There was no longer a shared understanding of what the battlefield actually was. Maps no longer matched reality. Timelines no longer aligned. Commanders were issuing solutions to a situation that had already evolved beyond them. The enemy's attempt to slow down revealed how deeply they had over. Units that tried to hold found themselves exposed, unable to dig in effectively or re-establish defensive depth. Those that attempted to pull back encountered congestion, loss of coordination, and pressure from angles they had not prepared to defend. What should have been a controlled adjustment became a scrambled mass disorder. This is where delay became lethal. Each minute spent debating the nature of the problem was a minute that reinforced it. The maneuver had succeeded in shifting the burden of action. Earlier, the enemy had acted while others reacted. Now, reaction was all they had left. And reaction under uncertainty is always slower than action guided by intent. Psychological fatigue compounded the damage. Leaders who had committed themselves publicly to the belief that victory was near found it difficult to reverse course decisively. To do so would have meant acknowledging a misreading that had already cost lives and resources. In that hesitation, opportunities disappeared. The battlefield did not pause to allow reflection. It punished it. Attempts to restore initiative came in fragments. A limited counterattack here, a sudden redeployment there. None were synchronized. None addressed the structural problem. Each created new vulnerabilities while failing to resolve existing ones. The enemy was no longer shaping the fight. They were chasing it. Meanwhile, the force that had initiated the maneuver did not rush to expose its success. They allowed the enemy's corrections to fail on their own. They applied pressure selectively, choosing moments that maximized friction rather than spectacle. This restraint made the enemy's struggle less visible from afar, which delayed recognition at higher levels and prolonged the paralysis. The most telling sign that recovery was impossible came not from losses, but from hesitation in execution. Units began waiting for confirmation before acting. Commanders requested clarification that could not arrive in time. Subordinate leaders deferred decisions upward. Initiative drained away, replaced by caution born of uncertainty. Once that happens, no amount of firepower can restore momentum quickly. By the time a coherent response was finally articulated, the conditions that response depended on no longer existed. The battlefield had changed shape. Supply lines were misaligned. Forces were positioned according to outdated assumptions. The enemy could still fight, but they could no longer dictate terms. The opportunity to reverse the maneuver had passed, quietly, without a single decisive moment to mark it. This is why the maneuver remains so difficult to recognize in real time. There is no clear signal that says recovery is no longer possible. Instead, there is a gradual accumulation of constraints until choice collapses into inevitability. The enemy did not lose because they lacked courage or strength. They lost because they waited too long to question what they thought they were seeing. The late realization did not bring clarity. It brought urgency without options. And in war, urgency without options is simply another form of defeat. The true impact of the maneuver did not announce itself with a single victory or a dramatic collapse. It revealed itself in what followed. In the days and weeks after the engagement, patterns began to change in ways that could not be ignored. Enemy operations slowed across the wider theater. Command decisions became more conservative. Movements that once showed confidence now carried hesitation. The battlefield where the maneuver unfolded had ended, but its consequences were still moving outward. Strategically, the most significant effect was not territorial. It was psychological and doctrinal. The enemy had lost trust in their own assumptions. For years, they had relied on predictable reactions, on the belief that pressure would always produce collapse if applied correctly. That belief had guided planning far beyond this single engagement. Now it was fractured. Commanders began questioning whether similar mistakes elsewhere were truly mistakes at all. This uncertainty altered how future operations were planned. Timelines expanded. Reconnaissance increased. Aggression was tempered with caution. All of this reduced operational tempo. The enemy became slower to exploit opportunities, slower to commit reserves, slower to press advantages. In war, hesitation spreads faster than confidence, and once it does, it reshapes entire campaigns. On the other side, the maneuver validated a different way of thinking. It proved that doctrine, while essential, was not sacred, that rules existed to be understood, not blindly obeyed. More importantly, it demonstrated that manipulating enemy perception could be as decisive as firepower. This lesson did not immediately replace established doctrine, but it began influencing how commanders evaluated risk and opportunity. Small changes followed. Planning staffs started incorporating deception and misdirection more deliberately. Movements that once would have been dismissed as too risky were reconsidered under specific conditions. Training emphasized adaptability alongside discipline. None of this was officially attributed to a single maneuver, but its fingerprints were there, quietly shaping decisions rather than rewriting manuals overnight. The enemy, meanwhile, never fully recovered their earlier confidence in exploiting perceived mistakes. The memory lingered. That hesitation showed itself whenever a familiar pattern broke unexpectedly. Commanders paused where they once surged. That pause gave their opponents time to reposition Chimmy, to react, time to survive. This is how the maneuver truly altered the course of the war, not by winning a decisive battle on its own, but by injecting doubt into an enemy system that depended on certainty. It disrupted a feedback loop that had previously favored speed and aggression. Once disrupted, it could not be easily repaired. Historians often look for turning points in grand offensives or decisive clashes. This maneuver resists that framing. Its power lay in what it changed indirectly. The enemy still fought, still inflicted damage, still achieved local successes, but the rhythm of the war had shifted. Momentum became harder to sustain. Errors became harder to exploit. In hindsight, analysts would note that this was the moment when initiative began slipping away, not because of defeat, but because of uncertainty. The maneuver forced the enemy to think twice at moments where instinct once guided them. That hesitation accumulated across operations, campaigns, and months. By the time the war reached its later stages, the effects of this shift were everywhere, though few could trace them back to this single decision. That is the mark of a truly transformative moment. It does not shout its importance. It embeds itself into behavior, shaping outcomes long after the original context has faded. And yet, the maneuver still carried one final lesson, one that went beyond strategy or doctrine. A lesson about how wars are decided not only by what is done, but by what is believed to be happening while it is being done. The final lesson of the maneuver was not written in orders, reports, or after-action summaries. It lived in how people thought afterward, in how commanders hesitated where they once rushed, in how assumptions were questioned instead of trusted, in how silence, restraint, and ambiguity were no longer automatically read as weakness. The maneuver did not just change positions on a battlefield, it altered how power itself was interpreted. What made this moment so unsettling was that it challenged a deep instinct in warfare, the belief that clarity equals control. For generations, armies had been trained to seek clarity at all costs. Clear lines, clear intent, clear reactions. The maneuver proved that clarity could be weaponized against those who depended on it too much. By presenting something that looked unmistakably wrong, it forced everyone watching to react according to habit rather than analysis. This is why the maneuver was so difficult to replicate deliberately afterward. It was not a formula. It was not a tactic that could be copied and applied mechanically. It depended on context, psychology, timing, and the enemy's own expectations. Remove any one of those elements, and the same movement might truly have been a mistake. That ambiguity is what made it powerful and dangerous at the same time. In later campaigns, some commanders tried to imitate the idea without understanding it. They violated doctrine without shaping perception. They created confusion without purpose. Those attempts failed, sometimes catastrophically. The maneuver worked because it was not random. It was disciplined ambiguity. It was restraint paired with patience. It was the willingness to endure doubt longer than the enemy could tolerate uncertainty. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth revealed by this episode is that the enemy was not defeated by superior force or brilliance alone, but by their own confidence. They believed they understood the battlefield. They believed they recognized failure when they saw it. The maneuver exploited that belief without ever confronting it directly. For the soldiers executing it, the experience left scars of a different kind. They had lived through moments where everything felt wrong, where trust in leadership was tested by fear and instinct. They followed orders that made no immediate sense and were rewarded only much later when the consequences became visible. That kind of discipline is rare, and it cannot be manufactured quickly. In the years that followed, historians debated whether the maneuver was intentional brilliance or fortunate improvisation. The truth sits somewhere between those extremes. It was not perfect foresight, but it was not luck either. It was a recognition that wars are not fought only on terrain, but inside minds, and once that insight is internalized, the nature of decision-making changes forever. The maneuver endures as a warning as much as a lesson, a warning that not every apparent mistake is what it seems, a warning that reacting too quickly to perceived weakness can create real vulnerability, and a reminder that the most decisive turns in war often happen quietly while everyone is watching the wrong thing. What remains unanswered is not whether the maneuver worked, but how many similar moments were misread, forgotten, or never recognized at all. How many wars were shaped by actions dismissed as errors until it was too late to undo their effects? That question lingers because it has no final answer. It simply invites attention, patience, and humility in the face of uncertainty. If you stayed until the end of this story, it means you understand something most people miss about war, power, and decision. So do this now, subscribe to the channel, because the next video builds directly on this idea of hidden turning points that were never meant to be obvious. Leave a comment below and write, "It looked like a mistake, so I know you made it all the way through and truly followed the logic behind this maneuver." And before you go, hit the like button, not just to support the channel, but to signal that these deeper, less obvious military stories deserve to be told. The next video is already on your screen, and if this one changed how you see war, the next one will push that even further.